Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for this Nuclear Reaction Symposium. I have the honor of introducing today's final speaker, Dr. Ernest J. Moniz, Cecil and Ida Green Professor Emeritus of Physics and Engineering Systems at MIT and Special Advisor to the President of MIT. As most of you also know, from May 2013 through January of 2017, Ernie served as the United States Secretary of Energy under President Barack Obama. Now, aside from his impressive resume and experience, which I will say a bit more about in a few minutes, it's particularly appropriate to have Ernie Moniz addressing us today. The nuclear reactions commemoration over this entire autumn quarter has been designed to be one that thoughtfully addresses the complex legacy of what occurred here 75 years ago tomorrow. This legacy is defined by both great opportunity and contributions to human well-being through nuclear energy production, medical applications, and more. It is also defined by the potential for destruction at a massive scale, a potential that itself is not simple to evaluate. Evaluating this dual feature of potential for great contributions as well as for great destruction has been a recurring theme of this commemoration. But this evaluation should not be thought about as being one that is only about nuclear fission, or in some cases, nuclear fusion. It is, in fact, a duality that is a constant for humanity to confront. Every power and capability and technology that is created can be used in positive or negative ways. And beyond that simple statement, there is always the argument about what is positive and what is negative. As we see technology advance dramatically in many ways today, the issue that we are bringing to the fore in commemorating the work of Enrico Fermi and colleagues, in fact, applies much more generally to technology advances of very different types. And every time we proclaim great positive power, there is lurking behind it great power for negative. Thus, the context for this commemoration is a fundamental and ongoing issue for humanity. It is this very complexity that makes Ernie Moniz and the care of thought that he applies to every issue such an important figure for us to hear from. He received his doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford and joined the MIT faculty in 1973. Over his distinguished tenure there, he has been the founding director of the MIT Energy Initiative, director of the Laboratory for Energy and the Environment, director of the Bates Linear Accelerator Center, and head of the MIT Department of Physics. Bringing to bear experience, expertise, and, as those of us who worked with him saw, a relentless demand for understanding and careful thought, Ernie's accomplishments as Secretary of Energy were powerful and far-reaching. Among others, he advanced energy technology innovation, environmental stewardship, and strengthened the Department of Energy's strategic partnership with its 17 national laboratories, including, of course, 2 Argonne National Laboratory and Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory that are operated by the University of Chicago. With regard to his time as Secretary of Energy, I think all of us are aware that Ernie was a central, indeed critical figure in promoting nuclear security and strategic stability, negotiating the historic Iran nuclear agreement alongside the Secretary of State. After serving as the Secretary of Energy, Ernie has continued his role as a global policy leader. He's been named co-chairman of the Board of Directors and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a nonprofit organization that has advanced innovative solutions for securing nuclear materials, building international cooperation for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, preventing the spread of disease, and reducing radiological threats. Time does not permit my naming all of Ernie's memberships and honors, but to name a few, he is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Humboldt Foundation, and the American Physical Society. We're deeply appreciative of Ernie coming to campus today to deliver closing remarks on the first day of our Nuclear Reaction Symposium. Please join me in welcoming Ernie Moniz.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that introduction, but even more for the invitation to join you today for this event. I might say it's great to be back here in Chicago for a bunch of reasons, including the fact, as you said, I think we had a terrific set of interactions with our laboratories, and having Argonne and Fermilab as two of those under the stewardship of this university is quite important. And I might just mention that, in particular, since you also mentioned the Iran negotiations, that frankly, when the president had me join John Kerry to negotiate the Iran agreement, the Department of Energy got a lot of attention, including, I might say, I think I can say this, from some of my cabinet colleagues. When the president said this, it was like, what's the Department of Energy doing with this, But the reality was, of course, the laboratories and some of our sites had always been involved in the Iran negotiations. They were the core. They were providing the analysis, and we had 7 laboratories, Argonne among them, that was providing the essential analytical support for the negotiating team. And so, as we were negotiating it, it was particularly good to have the time zone difference, so that we could assign homework at night and have it in the morning from our laboratories. Being here to celebrate acknowledge and celebrate the activities here in 1942 is really leads to some reflection. First of all, I think I would put this accomplishment, first of all, in the context of the broader Manhattan Project, which was an absolutely incredible, in less than 3 years, the science, the technology, and the organizational accomplishments that had to go on across the whole country, at Chicago and other universities, then at Los Alamos, which was created essentially from nothing, at production cities that were created from nothing, and Oak Ridge and Hanford, et cetera, all brought together, all having to succeed to accomplish the aims of the Manhattan Project. Pretty remarkable. I would note that of all of those accomplishments, I would say all but one were specifically targeted at, and including with hindsight, at the nuclear weapons capability. The exception was the one here, which right from the beginning had the dual nature of certainly being essential in the Manhattan Project going forward to its objective, but also recognizing that this was harnessing a new form of energy that could have beneficial applications. And now, ever since then, we've been trying to manage this one might call it tension between the two. Again, that dichotomy was recognized by Fermi and other of the physicists of that time, in both aspects. In fact, it is maybe someone here can either confirm or refute the story that Fermi, in some lecture after the war on atomic physics, pointed to the nucleus and said, "Here be dragons." Gino Segre told me at an earlier break that it sounds too poetic for Fermi, but I don't know. I think if there's a historian who knows the answer to that question, I would be very, very grateful. So we're going to talk a little bit on, and part of this may be repetitive, some of the promise, some of the benefits, and some of the challenges that we face today in the nuclear security arena. Let me first say on the quotes positive side that I'll say personally, Bob said a little bit about what I'm doing, but basically. to me, the three kind of major, they're all different in character, but the three major existential level kinds of threats over some different timescales, to me, are climate, the nuclear security issues, and biosecurity issues. Much of this driven by new technology. In the latter case, I won't go into the biosecurity, although I do want to advertise that at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, we actually have in our building a major biosecurity program, and there one has the developments in gene editing and CRISPR and the like have changed the game a bit there in terms of possibilities, both on the positive side and potentially on the negative side. But clearly, I will stay with the other two, the climate and nuclear issues, in which there is the intersection of those comes with nuclear energy. On climate, I think most who have studied it closely and look at the daunting goals that we have in terms of reducing carbon emissions would say that any scenario that has any chance of success has two common elements. One, tremendous progress on the demand side, demand reduction, energy efficiency and the like. And secondly, essentially a complete decarbonization of the electricity sector. Both partly because you can do it, and partly because the role of electricity will continue to increase. Indeed, success in decarbonizing the electricity sector leads to the next step: electrify as much of everything else as you can. In that context, nuclear power obviously has the advantage of being a carbon-free source. I'm sure this was discussed earlier, but just to emphasize that the majority of U.S. carbon-free energy production has been and still is nuclear power. And that's the context in which it is so critical to look at its admittedly complex future, certainly in this country and differently across the world. Now, but let me just pivot now to the nuclear security side. We'll come back later to nuclear power and the intersection of nuclear power and nuclear security issues. But turning to nuclear security, I have to say that unfortunately, my relatively new position at the Nuclear Threat Initiative is more exciting than I had wished it would be, given all the various news, particularly Korea and Iran, but also, frankly, the dealings with Russia. The word nuclear may not be articulated every time Russia is mentioned these days, but there is a strong intersection remaining with nuclear and Russia. I certainly believe that today the risk of a nuclear weapon being used is probably higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I didn't say it was a high probability, but higher than it has been in some time. And earlier there was a discussion, and maybe I'll come back to this, but it doesn't matter if I wander around a little bit. In the earlier discussion on nuclear weapons, the panelists agreed that terrorist acquisition was the biggest risk. Well, it's a big risk, and maybe we'll come back to that, but frankly, I don't quite buy that simple conclusion, and in particular, I would agree with the inference of the panelists that I don't think any country that has a nuclear weapon really wants to use it, but miscalculation is what is unfortunately become a more probable event than it was, and that's the basis fundamentally of my statement. Now, going back to Fermi and the dual nature, of course, in 1953, then Eisenhower made his famous Atoms for Peace speech at the UN, which roughly codified, in a certain sense, this duality. That later on came the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and of course that was, in simple terms, the bargain of the nuclear weapon states working towards elimination of weapons while providing assistance for other countries to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. I think when that was done, it's signed by 190 countries, so it's pretty, that's pretty impressive. And frankly, overall, as was said earlier, I think by Admiral Blair, the record is overall pretty good compared to what some of the projections were earlier on, but it's not good enough, and particularly in the context of, as I said earlier, miscalculations. I think when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, there clearly was not, and probably could not have been, an appreciation of how technology overall, I don't mean nuclear technology, but design technology, materials technologies, additive manufacturing now coming in, all kinds of technologies that have changed the equation in terms of who can and cannot master the technologies. And so in that sense, the NPT is challenged, and we'll come back to that. So in a certain sense, the other issue is the NPT offered a goal without a path. And it's many ways the path that is important. And frankly, at NTI, the organization has always, and certainly now with my being there, will continue to be focused on practical steps that manage risk and reduce threat. That's what the game is about. Putting goals down, I endorse the goals, fine. Now, what am I going to do to get there? And I think that's what we need to do, and that's where, in fact, today I had some discussions also with a couple of your faculty, with Don Lamb and Bob Rosner, and I think we have very similar ideas, and there's going to be opportunities for all of us in this technical community and policy community to collaborate going forward. I will just mention, before getting to some sort of to the topics of the day, that going back to what was said earlier in the panel about the terrorist threat, again, I am in no sense minimizing that, although I would add that if that is the case, that terrorist acquisition of a nuclear weapon is the greatest challenge, I would put it in a similar fashion of goals are fine, but what's the path? Well, we need to start then rethinking some very fundamental issues. How about forward deployment of nuclear weapons in Europe in this environment? Hard questions get raised when these things are stated, or get raised, and we should be prepared to start analyzing them and answering them. On the terrorist threat, a little bit was said, but maybe I'll say a little bit more, and it couples in a little bit to the last panel as well, and that is, it's clear that the consequences may be less, but the probability is enormously higher of a terrorist so-called dirty bomb, the dispersal of radioactive material, which is available all throughout society and through just about every country in the world. I will be honest, I am amazed that we have dodged the bullet up to now. Some of you may have seen in the, I think it was the New York Times this summer, some reasonably credible newspaper, that when ISIS was relieved of their control of Mosul, fortunately, the two large cobalt-60 sources in hospitals were not employed in any unfortunate way. But these are all over the place, and all blood is irradiated by cesium-137, conveniently available in powdered form. And while the damage is less, certainly in terms of anything like immediate deaths or the like, but our estimates certainly, done at one of our DOE laboratories, I'm sorry, not our anymore, at the DOE laboratories, is that, for example, the dispersal of a source in Manhattan could be in the $20–30 billion worth of damage. Try to get that insurance policy. So you know, I think these are really very, very serious challenges. But let me just go on and say a few words about some of the issues of the day and a few things about those. So I'll start with Iran and the JCPOA. It was stated earlier on the other panel that by Madeleine Creedon that what the president actually did was not do anything. He did not certify, he did not decertify, he did not certify, and that was, in some sense, she said it much more nicely, kind of a fake requirement put in by an additional U.S. congressional measure, which is now regretted. But so the real question is, what's going to happen going forward? What I want to say is, first of all, you may notice in terms of Congress now, in their 60-day window of responding to the president's lack of certification, shows no evidence of any activity. The dog that didn't bark is very important. So this is back in the president's hands for January is when the next event comes up, and we'll see what goes forward. But maybe it's worth saying a little bit more about what exactly the JCPOA is and what it might mean for going forward. Again, something that my colleagues here at Chicago are also thinking about. What the deal is and what the deal isn't are both important to understand, because in fact the critiques of the agreement at the beginning were almost completely about what the deal is not. It does not solve the missile problem. It does not solve the human rights problem. It does not solve the Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq, Houthi problems. There was a decision made, just as Ronald Reagan decided at the height of the Cold War to negotiate nuclear arms control with the Soviet Union, even as we had many, many other, shall we say, disagreements. This was a decision to take the existential question off the table, not a decision to in any way let up. Quite the contrary. The decision was made to try to increase the pressure on resolving these other issues. Whether we're doing a good job of that or not is something else, but that is the structure. What the deal is it turns back the Iranian program, nuclear program. It puts major constraints on it for 15 years. Some pieces come off at various time frames, but the major nuclear restraint, which is actually the constraint to maintain a stockpile of only 300 kilograms of uranium enriched to no more than 3.67%, which most of you, or many of you at least know, is below that, which is typical of a nuclear reactor fuel even. Maintaining that, by the way, versus the 12 or so tons that they had of higher enriched uranium, including higher enriched uranium, but maintaining 300 kilograms for 15 years with low enrichment is a very, very significant constraint. The issue is use those 15 years sensibly so that when we come out the other end, we're in a good place, as opposed to just complaining and doing nothing and wasting 5 years. Shame on us if this agreement goes forward and we haven't done the work to prepare what comes out the other end. Secondly, and I think even more importantly, the agreement has a set of verification measures, safeguards measures that are unprecedented. No one else is under these safeguards. That was clear because going into this, Iran had no trust in the international community in terms of weapons aspirations. They can, whether it's denied or not, it doesn't matter. It's a fact that there was no trust. Therefore, the statement was that what are regrettably, in my view, not sufficiently strong safeguards regimes around the world would not be adequate in this situation. And so we have those more stringent safeguard elements. That does not expire in 15 years. There are many permanent elements. There are novel elements like transparency of the entire uranium supply chain for 25 years. No one else has any of that kind of constraint. In addition to the verification constraints, another thing that is not in the NPT says you won't have a nuclear weapon. It doesn't say you won't carry out the activities of so-called weaponization research. The agreement eliminates that. Verifying it is more tricky, but eliminates that forever. So one should understand the strength of this agreement and what it has. In fact, I'm just going to end this by saying one of the things we're going to be doing at NTI, working hard, and the more the merrier, is we should start thinking about those kinds of transparency measures becoming the norm. That not only strengthens our global nonproliferation regime, but it gives us a leg up on Iran if they're no longer unique down the road. So we have to be more creative on this. We have to have dialogue. Frankly, in the negotiation, we always said, and I still say, the deal stands on its own in terms of what it accomplishes, as long as we remain in compliance. But clearly, we had hoped that maybe after a couple of years of compliance, a little more trust begins to build up, a little more collaboration, scientific collaboration, et cetera, and we could start working towards a different kind of relationship, which of course could only happen by resolving, turning down the temperature on some of these other regional problems where we got a lot of problems with what Iran is supporting. And finally, on this, I would just say that now we are faced with this question of the irony of turning the tables from 2 years ago, where the question was, will Iran really comply with this agreement? Now the question is, will the United States comply with this agreement? It is completely clear, and the Congress, I believe, has understood this, that if there were a vote today, it is not the same vote as in 2015. And indeed, people like Chuck Schumer and Ben Cardin, who voted against the deal, have made it very clear it would be detrimental to our interests at this stage now to be the ones to violate the deal. And one of the reasons is the Europeans have made it very, very clear. We walk away alone. That is a bad, slippery slope when you realize that it is precisely the 70-year effort this country has made to build alliances, to build institutions based on shared values, would be put once again at stake in that kind of an action, building on other things too, like the Paris Accord, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are. I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. All I know is we have to do what we can do, which is think through what it is we want in going forward with Iran and more broadly with the nuclear fuel cycle. So the nuclear fuel cycle, by which I mean all of the steps it takes to have a nuclear energy situation, as I said earlier, probably has gone beyond the original visions of those putting the NPT together. Nuclear power, it's here. It's like any technology, it's not going to go back in the box if that's what somebody wanted. It's not going to happen. So we have to manage it and get its beneficial aspects into play. There are many things we can do. There are institutional issues. How are ownership structures of facilities put together. There are technical issues, other kinds of verification measures to put in place. There are business issues. There are security issues. For example, NTI, as I said earlier, NTI is about taking steps that matter. They can be little steps, they can be big steps. This August, a 10-year effort was culminated in a ceremony in Kazakhstan dedicating a low-enriched uranium bank that is owned by the IAEA, hosted by Kazakhstan. NTI advanced this, secured $50 million from Warren Buffett to be matched 2-to-1, and indeed a $155 million effort has succeeded. What does this have to do with what we're talking about? The idea is to provide security of supply to any country whose nuclear supply might be interrupted, as long as they are in good safeguard standing with the IAEA, therefore providing any diminished motivation for or excuse for developing enrichment capability. So that's an example. That's a step. It's a foundation. Let's build on that kind of step as we look at the international nuclear fuel cycle. So there's a lot to do here, and I would just say that in the end, if we do not succeed in evolving how the fuel cycle is deployed and how the activities are verified, we will never, there's no pathway, in my view, then, to something like the vision of the world without nuclear weapons. You won't get there if there's not confidence in the community of nations that everybody is playing by the rules. Let me say a few words on North Korea, since another issue of the day. Obviously, if the goal, and the goal is and remains denuclearization, then obviously a lot of efforts over a long time have not succeeded by definition. All I will say here is that I believe, and I should say Sam Nunn and I partnered on a piece on this, for example, that we need to approach North Korea discussions in a totally different way. For one thing, while I endorse the choice of negotiating a nuclear-only agreement with Iran, the single-minded focus on nuclear weapons in North Korea, I believe, is misplaced. And the only way to address this is through a broader security discussion among the North and South Korea, China, Japan, Russia's involved, and we're involved because of our military posture in the region. And the reality is, until we sit down and see what everybody needs for a security posture, this problem is never going to get solved. And so, in a nutshell, I mean, I think that is the main thing. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, and I would be extremely careful, but it is interesting that following this week's new missile test in North Korea, there was one statement made by the leader that this completes a program. Well, maybe we should find out if he means it. I don't know. But we can't solve any of our problems without some dialogue. And again, we have to, as I think it was kind of said earlier, we need to consistently minimize the importance of nuclear weapons in military strategy. Denny Blair said it, it's deterrence, 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 deterrence. It's no use of nuclear weapons, which is the key, much more important than the long-term vision, as much as that vision is appealing and important. But that's what we need to do. We have not exactly been following this approach. I'm going to turn to Russia. look, the reality is, it's just counting. The United States and Russia remain the only real existential threats in the nuclear space for each other, in my view. Our relationship is in the ditch, and understandable, given Ukraine, given election meddling, given all of this. But the reality is, we always maintained nuclear dialogue, military-to-military dialogue, in the worst times of the Cold War. We have hit a low in this activity. We have to change this. NTI is certainly committed to this. I'll give you one little example. Again, Sam Nunn and I did an op-ed in the Washington Post. I think it was in August. The Congress, in the summer, passed a sanctions bill. That doesn't sound remarkable. We have a lot of sanctions bills. But what was different here is it removed presidential prerogatives for suspending the sanctions as part of any dialogue. Completely understandable why, in the current situation, the discussions with Russia might raise some concerns with Congress. However, if you look at the practical consequences of taking away that prerogative from the president, then you accomplish two things. You remove the political space for Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, if they are in the, if they have the opportunity for some dialogue. But secondly, you remove the incentive for Russia to engage in such discussions. The history of Congress being the one to relieve sanctions is not a cheerful one. Let's go to Jackson Vanik, 1976. Probably complied with by the early 80s. President Clinton states compliance in 1997, and the Congress lifts them in 2012. That is not a big incentive to get involved in discussions. So we just need to get back on course for discussions with a new nuclear dialogue. Again, we are trying at NTI to do our part in that, including publishing a list of about 50 projects that we think just make plain common sense as mutual nuclear security interests. One of those was in May, NTI catalyzed and sponsored a meeting, again in Kazakhstan, with the Department of Energy, IAEA, Russia, and the Central Asian republics about identifying and securing all of the radioactive sources that are strewn around the Central Asian republics, not a place where some terrorism would be unknown. So that's an example, a very practical step, and you just kind of build on these steps and hopefully keep going. We do think, and Sam Nunn in particular has been very strong on some of these things, that an agenda with Russia could include a new presidential joint declaration, such as Reagan and Gorbachev made on restating that a nuclear war cannot be won, must not be fought. Putin has made statements that are very similar to that. A joint statement could be very, very helpful. A new dialogue on cybersecurity, very tricky. But cyber risks to the command and control structure of nuclear weapons are a serious concern. Start with the US and Russia. We need to start taking steps. It's been a long time discussed. We simply need to increase the decision time that President Trump or President Putin and future presidents would have in the case of information of being under attack. As we know, we've seen this movie before. Mistakes, and we dodged bullets. The solution is decision time. We've got to get away from this prompt launch idea of possible miscalculation. Again, dirty bombs more generally, we could work together on that, especially with all the terrorism certainly along Russia's southern border and getting into the Middle East and elsewhere. And frankly, restarting a much more serious bilateral military-to-military dialogue as an important priority. Maybe Admiral Blair could comment, but it seems to some of us that it's just about at the lowest point it's been, certainly in a long, long time. These are all issues that can contribute to miscalculation and need to be addressed. So let me just end by going back a little bit to nuclear power and climate. Clearly, in the United States, nuclear power is under challenge. Well, first of all, the existing plants are under pressure from, especially from natural gas and renewables. The new plants being built in the Southeast, maybe being built in the Southeast, have had the kinds of huge cost overruns that we have also seen in Europe. I think we need two things. One is we need to internalize externalities in nuclear power and other carbon-free sources from the point of view of ultimately we're going to need some kind of carbon charge on carbon emissions. And I think a more controversial point would be to internalize some of the nuclear security issues that are associated with our having a highly weakened nuclear supply chain. The nuclear security issues are several. A major one is that the role the United States has played over a long time, and in many ways setting the standard for non-proliferation agreements internationally, was based upon the strong supply chain that we had. And so our bilateral agreements with countries could put very, very stringent issues on transfer of materials and the like, et cetera. Our weakened supply chain is now leading to a very different dynamic. For example, I certainly am not claiming that all of these plants are going to get built anytime soon, but the reality is Jordan has made some kind of commitment for nuclear power plants. Iran has commitments. Egypt has commitments. Saudi Arabia has commitments. Turkey has commitments. Every one of those with Russia. That is unlikely to be a positive development in non-proliferation. Secondly, the reality is we need nuclear materials for our nuclear arsenal, which, as Madeleine Creedon emphasized, as long as we have it, has got to stay safe, secure, reliable, as she said. The trouble is, we do not have the capabilities today to supply what we need, tritium, for nuclear weapons. We have a stock that we can use for a while. It ain't going to last forever. The reason is that just as we do not permit military use of our nuclear exports, other countries don't either, and we do not have an American enrichment capacity. That's a supply chain question. And third, we have a supply lasts for a while, but the Navy propulsion systems, not weapons, but propulsion, will need HEU. We don't have an American enrichment capacity. So we have a serious supply chain issue. We have these security issues. Whether or not that's another externality to be somehow internalized in costs remains to be seen. But I think innovation is going to be important, and here I would just end by saying that in this country it seems very unlikely today that we will see another 1,000+ megawatt plant being built, at least in my lifetime, it would seem. So we need some innovation here if nuclear power is to play a role in this very, very low carbon environment. Right now, there are various non-light water reactor activities. Argonne has been known to favor some of those, but also just from the point of view of even light water technology, the current so-called small modular reactors, it's the kind of thing we got to find out if that dog hunts. Is it going to perform economically? It's got great safety characteristics. There are reasons to be optimistic from the point of view that if you have a much smaller plant, you don't have the capital at risk. You may get better financing. You may want several hundred megawatts. Well, maybe you build them sequentially and actually develop some cash flow to start paying for the plants down the road. These plants are small enough. Build them in a factory environment and have all the benefits of quality assurance of a captive workforce, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if all of this will come together to give an effective, attractive source, but we're never going to find out if we don't get there. Somebody else will, and that comes again to the international arena. So I think with that, I will kind of come to a conclusion. Clearly, we've talked about both sides of the coin from those events of 1942 and as they have evolved. Again, I think on the security side, we clearly went through a set of challenges, but I think again, it's for us to clearly think about those, but it's for us to work at solutions. Again, manage risk, reduce threat. That's the program. There's a lot we can do, and we need to work really hard at it to be ready for when opportunity appears. Thank you.